You won't believe the power. You won't believe the scale. You won't believe the deinterlacing.
Whoa, there's no flicker! But what about Bob?
This is gaming with the power of 5X. Take control over your games. Bring them from the past to the future with the RetroTINK 5X. Unleash your inner child today.
We've honestly been in the middle of a golden age for retro gaming hardware for about 4 years now. 2017 really saw a big boost, both in the renewed interest online in retro video games and maintaining the hardware and tools to play them, but also in community-backed hardware projects to get the best possible image out of these ancient relics, and things continue to scale from there. The GameCube digital AV port was finally reverse engineered, HD Retrovision brought up incredible component cables for many systems and allowed many of us to throw away those awful European connectors, consoleizers became a thing, and proper, not crappy HDMI output modules and even direct HDMI mods for each individual system have blossomed. Along with that, so has the market of scaler devices available. The days of scrounging through ancient Extron hardware and government surplus sales are behind us, or above me in my attic, that is. And now we have a healthy market of options, even if the Framemeister is no more. The open source scan converter, or OSSC, has been kicking butt, and an OSSC Pro is on the way. The GBSC AIO mod project has gained some popularity, and a man by the name of Mike Chi introduced a wonderful product line by the name of RetroTINK. Cheap, high-quality line doublers that gave you a 480p output of any system via S-Video, composite, or component, and SCART on the dedicated SCART RetroTINK, and even 480p, 720p, and 1080i pass-through on the 2X multi-format. But this month, we've been blessed with a new RetroTINK. We're going beyond the mortal realms of 2X scaling. 3X? That's for chumps. 4X? Don't insult the tink. We're talking 5X scale, a clean, massive scale of your 240p and 480i retro games that takes up as much of your screen as possible without fiddling with sync issues, manually dialing in phase, selecting specific game or console profiles. Just plug in and play with some tweaks if you want to, but aren't at all needed for a great image. Not only does this make playing your retro games on modern displays easier, but it makes streaming or recording them in high quality way easier too. But it comes at a cost. I'm EposVox, the stream professor, and this is the RetroTINK 5X, the potential end-game upscaler unit for retro game consoles. This tiny little box right here looks unassuming, honestly, but it packs a serious punch. It takes micro USB power, which can just be powered by your computer or TV's USB ports, and accepts component YPBPR input, S-Video, and composite via the Y-Green jack, and a backward SCART connector for RGB video, and scales the feed, deinterlaces it if necessary, and it spits it back out in a clean, low latency, flicker-free 1080p HDMI video feed to capture, stream, and play to your heart's content. Plus it outputs 1200p and 1440p too. The front of the device features 3 buttons for navigating the on-screen menus, though the included remote will allow you to navigate the menus remotely. Though it's not the most intuitive layout, and I would hope for a remote overlay sticker like I have for the Framemeister and OSSC remotes. It's worth noting that the SCART port is actually backwards like I mentioned, so if you have an angled connector, it will be pointing towards the front of the device. This is an unfortunate mistake, but according to the device's creator in an interview with Bob from Retro RGB, submitting a redesign could potentially have prevented the RetroTINK 5X from ever releasing or increased cost due to production delays and the current chip crisis, so it wasn't worth addressing for now. Good thing SCART isn't worth addressing in the first place. That being said, the SCART connector is great for adding a secondary composite or S-Video input to the device with a basic pass-through adapter, though the included adapter in my box came with a completely bent up white audio cable jack that ate into my RCA cable without allowing it to plug in, so I couldn't use it. These adapters are just like $7 on Amazon, so just order another if yours came bent. Since you can't have composite or S-Video and component connected at the same time and maintain audio, it's worth having one of these for those inputs if you have them. There's an LED light inside the device that indicates power and changes color based on input selection. As mentioned, the RetroTINK 5X is a device that takes your retro game consoles and provides high-quality HDMI output for your modern TV or capture device. To use it, connect your console via the appropriate analog connection. My favorite is connecting systems like the PlayStation 2 with HD RetroVision component cables. Then connect the HDMI out to your TV or capture card. Lastly, connect the RetroTINK 5X to USB power. The USB port on your computer or television is fine. You may have to select an input, but otherwise you're done. That's all that's required to get an incredible image out of your older systems. Enjoy! That being said, there are a few advanced settings that you can tweak. By default, the RetroTINK 5X outputs a normal 1080p signal, but by navigating to the output format menu, you can actually change the output resolution. The easiest way is with the menu button here on the device itself, and then to change the menu like settings, and then to actually change what the setting is, use the option button. But there is an included remote. There's a brief guide included for what the buttons do, but I did find it annoying to try to navigate to additional options from there. Past the normal 1080p output, you have a couple more 1080p listings with various degrees of over and under scanning in case your TV is cropping off the image. There's also a 1200p mode, which is useful for those with 1920 by 1200 displays or TVs that will accept it, but not the next output. The last high-res mode is 1440p, which outputs a 1920 by 1440 signal, which is sharp and honestly incredible looking. Most 4K TVs should handle this fine, and this is the cleanest feed you can get from the device for your TV, using the high-quality scaling in the RetroTINK to get it up to 1440p, and then letting your TV upscale it the rest of the way to 4K. And it works great on 1440p monitors too, of course. There are some lower res modes for compatibility at 720p, 768p, as well as a basic 480p 2x mode, just to make sure that this outputs a signal that is compatible for basically everyone. Next up is a setting that can get pretty technical, but doesn't have to: horizontal sampling. As of the RetroTINK 2X Pro and multi-format, Mike had begun experimenting with doing crazy high sampling rates for the analog signal. This means that it's looking at the analog video feed's luma and chroma data, or brightness and color, at a much higher resolution than you might normally associate with these lower res games, like 1440 by 480 and all sorts of awesomeness. Well, that happens here too. By default, it's set to generic 4x3, which will generally work great for the vast majority of games you're playing with this. The only reason I'd recommend most people even touching this is the change to generic 16:9 for widescreen games. Otherwise, leaving this alone is fine. Phase is automatically dialed in for the sharpest image for each system, so you don't really need to manually configure much. But there are additional sampling profiles for scenarios where you know the specific resolution of games. For example, the SNES or PS1 games that run at 256 wide resolution, or Neo Geo games that run 320 wide resolution. Unfortunately, there's not a 512 PS1 sample mode. However, I have found it pretty difficult to get an easy resource that has accurate details for specific games. I have an article and a Google Doc link below with some details for some PS1 games, but it's not much. The issue being that you can get shimmering if you choose a mode that isn't accurate to your game. So honestly, unless you are really knee deep into this and know what you're doing, I recommend leaving it on generic 4x3 if you don't want to do the research. Next, you have the choice of two interpolation algorithms, sharp and soft. These are pretty self-explanatory in terms of the effect that they have. Sharp is basically nearest neighbor or integer scaling, which is perfect for 2D games, pixel art games, and etc., and still provides clean, sharp output for those 3D titles as well. Soft is by linear sharp scaling, which is a bit less sharp and pixel perfect, providing a nice edge blur for 3D games that looks a bit more appropriate. Most people can leave this on the default sharp and be happy, but I tend to swap to soft for PS2 3D games myself. Next, you have the scanline generator. It's still fake scanlines, which not everyone likes, and it definitely doesn't compress well, so I don't usually recommend it for streamers, but I will say that this implementation looks better than most. According to Mike in his interview on Retro RGB, most scanline generators do the equivalent of slapping a PNG overlay over the final image, whereas his scanline generation process is integrated into the scaling chain, resulting in more accurate looks. Here's a couple different modes available here, but keep in mind they won't compress well here on YouTube. Next is the vertical sync mode. By default, it's set to triple buffer, which allows the RetroTINK 5X to have 0 dropouts when switching from 240p to 480i and menus and such for games, which is game-changing for those who run into that. Typically, scalers have a hard time with losing the signal for a bit, which drops the connection to your TV, requiring a new handshake to get going, and it's even worse with a capture card. At best, it's an annoyance to your stream. At worst, you get killed in the game. This is a complete non-issue with the 5X. The other mode here is frame lock, which adheres more directly to what's being output and has lower latency, which both are under a frame anyway, so it's kind of negligible either way, but may have a slight hitch when switching modes like this. Next is the setting that really seals the deal, as this being the end game scaler for me compared to the Framemeister and OSSC, deinterlacing. In my mini masterclass on upscaling hardware, I discussed the disadvantages of the main deinterlacing method found in most line doublers, which is bob deinterlacing. It's fast, but it's flickery as can be and super obnoxious in many 480i games on the PS2, and it just doesn't look too hot in captures or stream. Personally, I hate it. I kept my Framemeister around because it uses a different deinterlacing method that doesn't flicker. I believe it uses weave deinterlacing. I could be wrong though. It's great some of the time, but it can still leave combing artifacts behind. It's a much more enjoyable experience than the OSSC, but it isn't perfect. The RetroTINK 5X includes a variety of deinterlacing options, including bob and weave and blend, but by default runs a magical motion adaptive deinterlacing that just works. 99% of the time there is no flicker and no combing artifacts. It's glorious, and it's the thing I've been waiting for years now. I cannot overstate how much of a better experience this is. And while there are apparently scenarios where it doesn't perform super well, I have honestly yet to encounter them. It looks fantastic in every game I try. I got sick of dealing with the OSSC's flicker, but got annoyed by the constant profile swapping of the Framemeister, and this pretty much answers all of my complaints. This deinterlacing method is far and above better than most of those available in any cheap component to HDMI converter as well, especially since with most of those, they will give you a ghosty image or only a 30 FPS output from 480i games like Champions of Norath or Tekken, which just looks so silky smooth at a proper 60 FPS. Lastly, there's two more options. The first is to disable the comb filter, which helps clean up composite video. I honestly see no reason to disable this. And then there's a switch between RGB full and limited color space if the levels aren't right on your TV. I'm not entirely sure this is implemented properly, as setting the RetroTINK to full and every capture card I tested to partial is what looked best. It was setting the capture cards to full to match didn't look correct at all, and setting the RetroTINK to limited was a completely washed out image that I just couldn't fix. I don't know, but probably just leave it on full, because that seemed to be what worked best. But your capture cards still need to be on partial. Man, I hate this RGB full versus partial thing. It's so needlessly confusing. I have even more good news and fixes when it comes to the OSSC and Framemeister comparisons. Console compatibility. I have tested this with just about every console I have and have had virtually no issues. And for those hoping to capture and stream, the day of checking my capture card reviews for Super Nintendo compatibility are over. The OSSC always outputs a funky timing from the Super Nintendo, which made capture card support a nightmare. This is not the case with the RetroTINK 5X. The output signals are standardized for this. Ironically, however, while the actual real Super Nintendo is supported well and compatible, here I did run into issues with the analog Super NT Mini with the analog DAC. Previously, this was a more compatible device to work with, and I have replaced my SNES with it after my childhood one died. But for whatever reason, I had all sorts of issues getting it to output via the RetroTINK 5X properly. 1200p output worked, but a couple of the 1080p modes did not, and 1440p did not. And even then, there was still some sort of vertical slip at the top, almost looking like a VHS tape. Super bizarre. But you should connect that with HDMI to stream anyway, so whatever. I just have mine connected by a component with the DAC to play on my BBM. The 5X even worked great with my Nintendo DS capture box over S-Video. Sharp Pokemon captures made easy, even if it is a smaller viewport due to the lower resolution of the DS. I also tested the PlayStation Portable via component cables here. It worked fine, and you get a decent 16:9 image in widescreen 480p mode upscaled, which is great. But the games run at a much lower resolution and smaller size than the OS navigation, an annoying quirk of the PSP's video output, and so you might have to crop in a bunch to get the best results. This is an area where the Framemeister actually plays out a little bit better, allowing you to zoom in more on the image for this purpose. But honestly, it's basically the same as cropping and scaling in OBS anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Not only do you get 240p scaled to 5x and 480i deinterlaced, but 480p gets scaled amazingly as well. So we, Xbox, PS2, and GameCube users rejoice. Especially great when paired with Swiss, forcing games to 480p on the GameCube. Oh man, this Spyro's widescreen mode on the GameCube is wide. And this isn't me stretching it out, this is how it outputs on my BVM as well. Cinematic. Awesomely, 720p passes through as well. There are only a tiny handful of older console games that can output at 720p, but you do have the ability to pass it right through. But it does not scale up to 1080p or 1440p. The 5X just outputs a 720p signal. I have my PS3 and Xbox 360 ran through my component setup to play on my BVM here, so being able to still easily stream and capture these while playing in 720p on my BVM is a nice plus. 1080i is also passed through, as I confirmed here with Gran Turismo 4 on the PS2. It looks wonderful, but it can be hit or miss. Modern Vintage Gamer noted that when running it through RGB cables instead of component, he could not get 1080i to work with the RetroTINK 5X. Use component anyway. Honestly, most games are not worth playing in 1080i. It's a cool tech demo, but realistically your actual play should be in 480p. MVG also noted some issues with 50Hz signal output from his older computers. That's not really what this is built for, but it's worth noting regardless. I anticipate both of these being addressed in firmware updates eventually. Something that really stood out to me during Bob's interview with Mike Chi about the RetroTINK 5X is how he had to go from hardware tinkerer to software developer for this project. He's been learning new skills and improving his knowledge with each release, and it shows. If you want to be like Mike, and improve your skills for future projects, do it with today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an awesome online learning community where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey. They have thousands and thousands of inspiring classes on topics such as productivity, film and video, photography, and even web development, and a bunch more categories. Skillshare is for beginners, pros, dabblers, and masters who want to improve their skill set or just learn a new skill entirely. No matter your goals, Skillshare has classes to fit your schedule and skill level. If you want to do what I do, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube course from Marquez Brownlee, or MKBHD. It's got some good stuff in there, and I enjoyed seeing how his team's workflow works as well. The first 1,000 people to use my link in the video description will get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership. Check it out. Honestly, looking at the differences between all of these devices run through capture cards to then be compressed again by your stream is perhaps not the best use of time, but let's cover some worthwhile notes. In terms of image quality, I generally found the RetroTINK 5X to be sharper and clearer looking than the Framemeister by a fair bit, but the Framemeister and the 5X have the most similar looking colors out of any of the comparisons that I looked at. The OSSC is similar in terms of relative sharpness and clarity to the 5X. If you capture in a full 444 chroma subsampling, you may notice a difference in the fringing of pixel edges between the OSSC and the RetroTINK 5X, as the 5X only outputs 422, but this only matters when blowing it up super big after you've already captured it. The 5X still samples at crazy high rates. The 422 output matters far less, as it's only the final image that has already been scaled anyway. All of my captures were done in NV12420 anyway, as that's the final stream you will see. You can obviously get a much sharper image more quickly out of the 5X than the 2X RetroTINKs due to the higher resolution output, especially in 1440p mode, which I used for most of my captures. But with the right scaling tricks, as I've shown in previous videos, that's mostly a non-issue for those who already have a 2X. I do prefer how easy it is to get a proper 4:3 aspect ratio image out of the RetroTINK 5X, while the generic 4:3 profile in the OSSC can be a little squashed. I prefer an easy, accurate 4:3 to the pixel perfect timings anyway, as Try from My Life in Gaming explained in my last video, linked below. I do want to note that there is a major color difference between the RetroTINK 5X and both the older RetroTINK 2X products and the OSSC. The latter two seem to have a much more punchy, contrasty, and saturated image compared to the RetroTINK 5X and the Framemeister. No amount of capture card swapping, RGB full versus partial changing, etc. that I did identified any sort of user error here. Every scenario, this difference is present. Comparing the feed on my computer monitors side by side with the analog game actually rendered on my BVM, I find the RetroTINK and the Framemeister colors to be a bit more natural and accurate. So perhaps an older RGB conversion is to blame for the other devices looking more punchy. But I understand why people may prefer the OSSC and 2X look, because it's got more there. If so, both OBS and your television give you control to boost saturation or contrast levels, so it's a non-issue in my opinion. At least with my crappy S-Video cables, comparing my Nintendo 64 over S-Video to the Eon Super 64, I didn't see any major differences, but that is not a bad thing. It's been said that there's a little more noise if you zoom in on the RetroTINK 5X. I see this in some cases, but then in others it seems to have less. But my signal chain seems to have noise on all devices, as you can see. I think the G-Comp switch is actually to blame, unfortunately, but realistically you're not zooming in this much anyway. I primarily play my retro systems on a CRT, my BVM D24. It was expensive, and I have made a couple videos on it now. But the reality is, I truly believe the RetroTINK 5X will bring us to a point that more and more people will feel we just don't need CRTs anymore for retro systems. The quality is up, the latency is down, and the experience is so smooth, especially with the fast 240p to 480i switching. Having played both on LCDs with the 5X and on my BVM during my captures that I did here, the only system I truly feel still needs a CRT is the Nintendo 64. It doesn't matter how much smoothing you do, how much deblur apply, how much you scale it, the Nintendo 64's output just looks horrible on a modern TV, even with my RGB modded system. The system looks truly like a completely different system in a completely different reality when running on native resolution on a CRT compared to anything a scaler can do. It's sad, but honestly the 64 was never my favorite system, so I guess I personally don't care all that much. Playing my retro games on my LG CX OLED was a dream, and had I had this setup a couple years ago, I probably would still keep some of my CRTs around, but I probably wouldn't have invested in my BVM. The experience here is that great. As amazing, powerful, and flexible as the RetroTINK 5X is, it's not without a little bit of flaws. I mentioned the analog Super NT Mini compatibility issue. I'm sure there's some other obscure compatibility out there that is still broken, but these can likely be fixed with firmware updates once people test more of these obscure devices and submit bug reports and things like that. Personally, I hate the remote. I don't like the generic remotes that aren't labeled for the purpose. Even if I remember something one day, 3 weeks later when I go to boot it up after I've been working all day again, it'll be useless to me. Hopefully we get remote overlays like I have with the OSSC and the Framemeister. I've run into a weird issue where if I boot up the 5X before plugging in my system, it doesn't detect any video input once the system is plugged in and turned on, even when cycling through the inputs. I can even get audio passing through over HDMI while it doesn't detect video. It's super strange and a simple replug works, but it's annoying and I'd have concern with how some switches might actually play with it if that's the case. That being said, I ran mine from the output of my G-Comp switch and the output of my BVM with the G-Comp switch running into it, and didn't have any issue, but this was mainly an issue when connecting directly to the consoles, ironically. This is pretty frustrating since the previous RetroTINK 2X products have pretty smooth auto input switching. I would have loved for the remote to have buttons for a couple overall system presets, given there aren't really many settings that you'd want to change regularly, and if I could just have like an A and a B for 4x3 and 16:9 games rather than clicking through all the menus over and over and then forgetting to change the horizontal sampling back, some quick load presets would be amazing. I would also love some additional zoom in options on the output. I don't know if this is even possible, but for scenarios like the PSP or my DS Nitro box, scaling it up would be lovely. Again, you can crop in an OBS or scale up a bit on your TV, though your control there may be limited depending on the scenario, but then you just have to reset it all for other games. Just ruminating ideas. Actually, back to the presets with that, I'd definitely love to have like 4 preset buttons on the remote. 4x3, 16:9s, and then a couple niche specific ones. This feels contradictory though, because the big selling point for me for this scaler over other scalers is the fact that you don't need profiles to really use it. You can just leave it on defaults and never know or care what the rest do, and it'll still look amazing. So maybe embracing profiles would be counterproductive there. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. The RetroTINK 5X is missing the smoothing filter from the previous RetroTINK products. This is somewhat redundant with the soft scaling interpolation maybe, but I do still prefer the look of it for Nintendo 64 games, so maybe it can be added back in a firmware update later to bring it up to par with the earlier RetroTINKs Neon Super 64. I'm not sure. One last complaint, and it is a silly one. I don't feel the device has enough heft. Obviously it's heavier than the smaller 2X units and it weighs more than the OSSC, but it's still lightweight. I worry that in some TV stands or streaming setups it might be too easy to pull away from where you want it to stay, especially after you awkwardly route the backward SCART cable over everything, and it would be a hassle to make look neat. But obviously, thicker and heavier cases means higher material and shipping costs, so there's that. The RetroTINK 5X includes a couple niche features that don't really apply to streaming, but I wanted to give a couple quick mentions to just to mention that they were there. One being light gun compatible borders, and the other being a 240p downscale. Yes, if you use a lag-free HDMI to component converter, I have one linked below, you can use this to downscale your modern retro games to 240p to play on a CRT. Though then you have to also use a secondary lag-free HDMI to component converter to get the HDMI out to your TV. This could be really neat for playing modern retro games on a CRT or remasters of classics like Final Fantasy VII or Crash Team Racing, or everyone's CRT request, Sonic Mania. I'll link below to a My Life in Gaming episode all about using another scaler, the GBSCAIO, but the idea is the same for 240p downscaling. It's worth mentioning here that the RetroTINK 5X updates its firmware over USB. Hold down the menu button when plugging it in, the light turns red, and then you can run the firmware updater software. Neat! You'd think this capture card compatibility section would be the meat and potatoes of this video, but the RetroTINK 5X honestly makes my job easy, as it's pretty widely compatible. As I mentioned before, the issues scaling the Super Nintendo are long gone, and just about any capture card that will accept a 1080p 60 signal will accept the 1080p output from the 5X just fine. It's pretty normal. Many 1080p devices will also accept the 1200p mode too, as the 1080p chips are usually compatible with 1200p in general, it's in spec. Heck, many 1080p TVs might even accept 1200p as well, which is pretty neat. 1440p is where you might run into trouble. Generally speaking, the 4K capable capture cards are also built for 1440p and will accept the signal. The Magewell 4K card handles it natively and is great. The AverMedia Live Gamer 4K accepts the signal, but you're forced to add it to OBS at 2560 by 1440 instead of 1920 by 1440, and you can't overwrite it, so you have to squish it back to 4:3. I use the aspect ratio corrector filter in OBS for this, and it seems to work great. Surprisingly, the Elgato 4K 60 Pro actually lets you capture it at 1920 by 1440 in the proper aspect ratio, which is nice. With both the Live Gamer 4K and the 4K 60 Pro Mark II, just make sure you add it as YUI2 to get the native 422 output of the RetroTINK 5X and have higher quality scaling available. The AverMedia Live Gamer Duo is unfortunate. In the first HDMI input, actually designed for your 1440p 120 and 4K 60 game inputs, it doesn't handle the 1200p nor 1440p modes at all. Not sure what's up with that, but they're aligned wrong and keep cutting out. The 1080p modes were great, however. But then the second HDMI input that's only designed to take a 1080p camera input in the first place works well with the 1200p mode? 1440p is still a no-go. What a weird result regardless. The Magewell 1080p cards I'm learning are not quite as flexible as their 4K counterparts. These not only seem to have issues with the OSSC, but they also won't accept the 1440p output from the RetroTINK 5X, as I was disappointed to discover when testing my brand new Magewell quad. The 1200p mode works great, however, as do the 1080p modes. Honestly, if you're just streaming to Twitch, 1080p modes are all you need. 1200p is a nice upgrade, so that's fine. And you can always nearest neighbor scale your footage to 4K for YouTube videos after capturing, or in OBS using the area or point scaling filters for that purpose as well. So I think we've covered enough at this point. The RetroTINK 5X is a phenomenal scaler that I think truly starts to represent the end game for retro gaming hardware and solves just about every problem I've had with my previous scalers so far. I loved what the Framemeister and the OSSC have done for the retro scene, but honestly, I'm not sure I will miss either of them. I surely won't miss Bob. Deinterlacing, not Bob himself. Can't get rid of that guy, he's too important. However, I'm not gonna stop looking at other scaler hardware. During my move, I was sent the GBSCAIO, a community mod project of an existing scaler, which has some exciting implications, and I recently ordered another old presentation scaler based on the recommendation of a commenter to play with. Part of the reason is because different tool developers focus on different things and implement different features and cool stuff, neat tricks and things like that. But another reason is because the RetroTINK 5X is pretty expensive at $300 USD, whenever it's actually in stock. This is inflated due to the absurd reality of chip and semiconductor shortages and the ever-scaling cost of making electronics that we're dealing with for the foreseeable future, but also because this is mostly Mike Chi's attempt at making a no-compromises device using a full FPGA processor instead of the existing basic scaler chips and lots of development work. It just costs money. Having bought a Framemeister at this price, as well as having bought the OSSC and many other scalers, I feel confident saying the price is worth it. Many of the best quality things in the retro scene aren't cheap. This isn't a mass-produced product market. It's an expensive hobby made by hobbyists. But I do understand that people may have limited budgets and that may be hard to swing. I generally recommend just going with the cheaper RetroTINK 2X products in that case. I have a previous video all about those, linked below. That being said, the price is compelling for one key reason. That is simultaneously a reason that many might argue the device itself is already irrelevant. HDMI mods. Every few months, we're seeing new HDMI mods developed for new systems, the Nintendo 64, the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 1, and the Xbox being notable recent releases. These usually give you a direct digital-to-digital video feed and scale directly within the system without any noisy analog conversions and lots of additional tools or bonus features included. These are incredibly wonderful, and I'm working on getting duplicate systems to have HDMI modded systems available for capture as I can, but they aren't plug and play. They require physical, often permanent hardware changes and modifications to your systems, usually with some not super beginner-friendly soldering techniques being required as well. And they're usually at least $100 US per console. So if you have a singular specific console that you really adore and you want to keep future-proofed, sure. An HDMI mod makes more sense and it's probably a great way to go, or if you don't want a mod, getting something like a dedicated RAD 2X for it, which is basically a RetroTINK 2X, is the way to go. But if you are an all-around retro gamer with a collection of consoles that you want to swap out or have run through a switch, you just want to buy a singular scaler that will handle all of them with ease, and the RetroTINK 5X is the one to go with. If you can swing the price, in my opinion. Well, that about wraps up this review. It was a big one, and I needed to release the upscaling mini masterclass to point you to for additional context beforehand. But this product is truly awesome, and I always have a blast working on these kinds of reviews. Supply is going to be hit or miss for a while, as with literally everything else in 2021, but I'll have RetroTINK's website linked below if you want to try to pick one up for yourself. Down there, I'll also have links to great reviews from Retro RGB, Modern Vintage Gamer, and My Life in Gaming, as they cover, a little different perspectives that I don't. Get subscribed and hit the like button, and come join us on Discord at discord.gg/EposVox to talk about the latest retro gaming hardware, developments, streaming stuff, or download your free copy of the backing track music I've been using in the videos for a while now. I'm gonna go play more PS2.